January 17, 1945. Rechlin, Germany. The winter sky hung low and grey over the Erprobungsstelle Rechlin airfield, where frost clung to the cowlings of aircraft that would never fly again. A young Luftwaffe mechanic named Werner Hoffmann stood before a Messerschmitt Bf 9G WW2, his breath forming clouds in the bitter cold. His hands, blackened with engine grease and frostbite, traced the fuselage one final time. The black crosses on the wings, symbols that once struck fear across European skies, now seemed like epitaphs on a tombstone. In the distance, the rumble of Soviet artillery grew louder each day. The Third Reich was collapsing, and with it, the fate of thousands of aircraft hung in a silence more ominous than any air raid siren. What Werner could not have known, as he stood in that frozen moment, was that his beloved machines would soon become the spoils of a new world order scattered across continents, dissected in foreign laboratories, and repurposed for causes their designers never imagined. For 6 years the Luftwaffe had been the iron fist of Nazi conquest. From the blitzkrieg over Poland to the desperate defense of the fatherland's skies, these machines had been instruments of both terror and engineering marvel. By 1939, Germany possessed the most technologically advanced air force in the world. Sleek fighters like the Bf 1009, the twin-engine destruction of the Bf 1110, the screaming dive of the Ju-87 Stuka, and heavy bombers like the Heinkel He-111 that had darkened the skies over London. German engineers had pushed the boundaries of aviation science, developing the world's first operational jet fighter, the Messerschmitt Me-26-2, and rocket-powered interceptors that seemed torn from the pages of science fiction. But technology alone could not sustain an empire built on conquest. By the spring of 1945, as Allied forces closed in from east and west, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, grounded by fuel shortages, decimated by attrition, and scattered across hundreds of airfields from Norway to Italy. When the Reich finally surrendered on May 8, 1945, more than 5,000 Luftwaffe aircraft remained, distributed across occupied Europe like the remnants of a shattered dream. The victorious Allies, America, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union stood at the threshold of a new challenge. What does one do with the weapons of a defeated enemy? For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, the answer was clear: disarmament, imprisonment, repatriation. But for the aircraft, those silent vessels of aluminum and ambition, the answer would reveal something profound about the victors themselves, their curiosity, their pragmatism, and their hunger for the secrets these machines contained. The German pilots and ground crews who surrendered expected humiliation, perhaps execution. They had been told by their propaganda ministers that the Allies, particularly the Soviets, would show no mercy. Many pilots flew their final missions not toward combat, but toward the West, desperately seeking to surrender to American or British forces, rather than face the Red Army. They anticipated their aircraft would be destroyed immediately, burned in great pyres, as symbols of Nazi aggression, reduced to scrap metal for rebuilding a devastated continent. What they encountered instead was something far more unsettling: methodical preservation. Allied intelligence officers arrived at captured airfields with clipboards and cameras, not torches. They catalogued each aircraft by type, variant, and condition. They interviewed mechanics about maintenance procedures. They photographed technical manuals and production records. The Germans watched in confusion as their conquerors treated the machines not as trophies of war but as textbooks to be studied. The Americans called it Operation Lusty, the Luftwaffe's secret technology program. Teams of technical intelligence officers fanned out across occupied Germany, racing against time and Soviet competitors to secure the most advanced aircraft before they could be destroyed or captured by others. The prize specimens included the Me-26-2 jet fighter, the Arado A-2034 jet bomber, the Heinkel He-162 Volksjäger People's Fighter, and the extraordinary Messerschmitt Me-16. At captured facilities in Bavaria and Thuringia, American engineers discovered not just operational aircraft, but entire factories, wind tunnels, and research documents that detailed years of aerodynamic research. In June 1945, a fleet of over 50 German aircraft was prepared for transport to the United States. They were disassembled, crated, and loaded onto ships bound for Freeman Field in Indiana and later Wright Field in Ohio. Among them were machines that had never been seen in Allied skies, prototypes and experimental designs that represented the bleeding edge of aviation technology. The British conducted similar operations under the code name Operation Surgeon, seizing aircraft and technical personnel from facilities in their occupation zone. The Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough became home to captured Luftwaffe machines, where British test pilots would fly German jets and analyze their performance characteristics. The French, though their aviation industry had been devastated by years of occupation, also claimed their share, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, that would serve in French squadrons during the early post-war years. But it was the Soviets who pursued captured German aviation technology with the most systematic intensity. The Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses during the German invasion, and Stalin understood that future conflicts would be won by technological superiority. Soviet trophy brigades swept through eastern Germany, dismantling entire aircraft factories and shipping them back to the USSR, along with thousands of German engineers, technicians and scientists who would spend years in Soviet captivity, rebuilding their life's work for new masters. What the German aviation community experienced in those months after surrender was a profound cognitive dissonance. They had built these machines to dominate, to project power, to enforce the will of a regime that promised a 1,000-year empire. Now those same machines were being disassembled by enemy hands, their secrets laid bare, their components studied under foreign microscopes. Willy Messerschmitt, the brilliant designer, whose name graced Germany's most famous fighters, watched from house arrest as his creations were catalogued and shipped away. He had envisioned his aircraft as instruments of German superiority. Instead, they became teachers in classrooms he would never enter, instructing Allied engineers in swept-wing design, jet propulsion, and high-speed aerodynamics. The transformation was complete, from weapons of conquest to artifacts of inquiry. In the United States, captured Luftwaffe aircraft underwent exhaustive testing. American test pilots, many of them combat veterans who had fought against these very machines, now sat in their cockpits and pushed them to their limits. The experience was revelatory. Flying the Me-26-2, American pilots discovered that German jet technology was, in some respects, superior to anything the Allies had developed. The aircraft's swept wings and twin Jumo 004 turbojets gave it a speed advantage that would have been devastating had Germany possessed the fuel and trained pilots to deploy it in numbers. Similarly, the Arado A-2034 proved to be an exceptional reconnaissance platform, with speed and altitude capabilities that made interception nearly impossible. These discoveries accelerated American jet development programs, influencing the design of aircraft like the F-86 Sabre, which would dominate the skies over Korea just 5 years later. The Soviets integrated German technology even more direct. Captured Junkers Jumo engines were reverse-engineered and put into production as Soviet power plants. German swept-wing research, conducted in wind tunnels at Göttingen and Peenemünde, became the foundation for Soviet jet fighter design. The MiG-15, which would face American Sabres in Korean combat, owed much of its performance to German aerodynamic research. Perhaps most significantly, captured V-2 rocket technology and the German scientists who developed it, though not strictly Luftwaffe assets, would propel both Soviet and American space programs for decades. The conquered technology became the seed of the Cold War arms race. Across occupied Germany, ordinary citizens scavenged the airfields that dotted the landscape. Children played in abandoned hangars where mechanics had once worked around the clock. Farmers used aluminum from downed aircraft to repair equipment and build sheds. The Messerschmitt factory at Regensburg, which had once produced hundreds of fighters per month, stood silent and empty. The symbolic weight of this transformation was not lost on those who witnessed it. The machines that had represented German technological prowess, that had embodied the Nazi vision of racial and industrial superiority, were now reduced to raw materials, repurposed for the mundane tasks of survival in a defeated nation. The sound of Daimler-Benz engines that once filled the sky was replaced by the clatter of dismantlement, the hiss of cutting torches, the crash of aluminum falling to concrete floors. Yet not all Luftwaffe aircraft met such inglorious ends. Some found new lives in unexpected places. In Switzerland, which had maintained armed neutrality throughout the war, the Air Force operated Messerschmitt Bf purchased before and during the conflict. These aircraft remained in Swiss service until the 1950s, painted in neutral colors, defending a nation that had never joined the battle. In Czechoslovakia, the Avia aircraft factory continued producing Bf under license after the war, supplying them to the nascent Israeli Air Force. In one of history's bitter ironies, Messerschmitt fighters designed for a regime that perpetrated the Holocaust flew combat missions in defense of the Jewish state, bearing the Star of David instead of the swastika. The Czechoslovak-built Avia S-99, a crude variant of the Bf, became Israel's primary fighter during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, flown by pilots who had survived Nazi death camps and ghetto uprisings. In Spain, where Franco's dictatorship had maintained cautious relations with Nazi Germany, Spanish-built versions of the WWII called Hispano Aviación WW2 remained in service until the late 1960s, powered by Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same engines that had powered the British Spitfires that once fought against their German predecessors. This technological hybridization symbolized the strange new world that emerged from the war's rubble, where former enemies became allies, and old allegiances dissolved in the face of new ideological division. The preserved aircraft that survived the immediate post-war period became historical artifacts, museum pieces that educated new generations about the war's technological dimension. At the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, at the Royal Air Force Museum in London, at the Deutsches Museum in Munich, carefully restored Luftwaffe aircraft stand silent, their propellers still, their guns empty. Visitors walk past them, reading plaques that describe performance specifications and combat histories. Children marvel at their sleek designs. Historians study their construction techniques, but something essential has been transformed in this preservation. These machines, once animated by ideology and violence, have become pedagogical tools, teaching lessons their creators never intended, about the futility of conquest, the double-edged nature of technological progress, and the strange afterlives of defeated empire. The engineers and pilots who built and flew these aircraft carried their own transformations into the post-war world. Many German aviation specialists emigrated to the United States or South America, where their expertise was welcomed despite their wartime service. Others rebuilt their lives in a divided Germany, working in industries far removed from aviation, their knowledge of swept wings and jet turbines gathering dust. A few, conscripted by the Soviets, spent years in captivity, their skills exploited until they were no longer useful. The psychological weight of this transition from masters of the sky to displaced experts in a world that had moved beyond them, manifested in the memoirs and interviews they left behind. They spoke not of victory or ideology, but of the machines themselves, describing them with the affection of craftsmen for their tools, as if by focusing on the technical details they could avoid confronting the larger moral questions about what those machines had been used for. Throughout this vast redistribution of German aviation technology, one recurring element emerged as a symbol of the transformation: the aircraft manual. Before the war, German technical documentation had been a model of precision and thoroughness. Every system, every procedure, every performance parameter was meticulously recorded in handbooks that were works of technical literature. When Allied intelligence officers seized these manuals, they discovered more than operational instructions. They found a philosophy of engineering, a worldview that valued systematic knowledge and technical mastery. The Americans translated these manuals, studied them, adapted their principles. The Soviets did the same. The French, the British, the Dutch, all examined these documents and absorbed their lessons. The manuals became intellectual seeds, propagating German engineering culture across the victor nations, influencing how aircraft would be designed and documented for generations. In this way, the Luftwaffe's legacy persisted, not through military might, but through the quiet power of systematic knowledge, written in careful Gothic script on yellowing pages that passed from hand to hand across continents and decades. By the 1950s, the fate of the Luftwaffe's aircraft had been largely settled. Most had been scrapped, their aluminum recycled into pots, pans, and building materials. A few hundred survived in museums, private collections and foreign air forces. The advanced jets and rockets that had seemed so revolutionary in 1945 were already obsolete, surpassed by new generations of American and Soviet aircraft that incorporated and expanded upon their innovation. The Me-26-2, which had terrified Allied bomber crews, was now a curiosity, slower than the latest fighters, its straight-wing design replaced by swept configurations that German research had pioneered. The age of the propeller-driven fighter, which had dominated warfare from 1939 to 1945, was ending. The WW9 and WW90, which had been produced in the tens of thousands, were becoming relics, their wooden propellers and liquid-cooled engines, symbols of a technological era that had passed. The final transformation came not through destruction, but through memory. As the generation that built and flew these aircraft aged, their stories began to shift. The bitter narratives of defeat gave way to more reflective accounts. Former Luftwaffe pilots gathered at reunions, comparing their wartime experiences with those of their former enemies, who sometimes attended as honored guests. A strange fraternity emerged, the Brotherhood of Aviators, who had tried to kill each other decades before. They spoke of the machines they had flown with a nostalgia stripped of ideology, remembering not the swastikas on the tails, but the sound of the engines, the feel of the controls, the beauty of flight itself. In this final act of transformation, the aircraft were separated from the regime that built them, reclaimed as pure expressions of engineering achievement, rather than instruments of conquest. On a spring morning in 1995, 50 years after the war's end, an elderly man stood before a restored Messerschmitt Bf at an air show in Bavaria. His name was Werner Hoffmann, the same mechanic who had serviced fighters at Rechlin in the war's final winter. He placed his hand on the fuselage, feeling the cool aluminum beneath his palm. The aircraft was pristine, its paint gleaming, its engine silent but preserved. Around him crowds gathered to admire the machine, to take photographs, to marvel at its design. He thought of the young man he had been, standing in the cold 50 years before, watching his world collapse around him. He thought of the pilots who never returned, of the cities reduced to rubble, of the vast machinery of death that these beautiful machines had served. And he thought of the strange journey these aircraft had taken from weapons of war to objects of study, to artifacts of history. In their transformation, he saw a reflection of his own life, of a nation that had been defeated and rebuilt, of technology that could serve both destruction and knowledge. The engine that once powered conquest, now taught lessons in museums. The wings that carried bombs now carried memory. And in that transformation, there was something redemptive, not enough to erase the past, but perhaps enough to learn from it, to ensure that the beauty of human ingenuity might someday be separated from the ugliness of human violence.